Have you ever witnessed a moment when silent courage changes everything? Imagine an elderly veteran, someone who once fought for freedom, humiliated in the middle of a diner purely because of his worn-out jacket. But what happens when a stranger stands up, utters 5 mysterious words, and shakes the entire town as the sun sets? This is the story of John Miller, a Marine who saved his comrades in the nightmare of war, yet was forgotten by the very community he loved. When an arrogant manager tried to drive him out of Liberty Diner, a stranger with a hidden past rewrote history. Can respect triumph over injustice? Join us on this emotional journey, where honor is restored and a town relearns the meaning of gratitude. If you believe in the power of silent heroes, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an inspiring story like this. Now, let's begin. In the little town of Fairview, Pennsylvania, where life drifts slowly on the breeze and echoes of autumn past linger, there stood a diner called Liberty Diner. No flashy signboard or high-tech marquee was needed. For over 60 years it had thrived as the very heartbeat of the community. Cream-washed brick walls warmed by the sun, worn leather booths fraying at the corners, and an old jukebox resting quietly in the corner, all combined to create a cozy space, as if time had forgotten how to pass. But Liberty Diner was more than coffee and pie. It was a witness. It was where elderly couples still held hands over Sunday breakfast, where young people escaped the rush of everyday life, and above all, where John Miller, a Marine veteran, had poured out his trust, his affection, and a chunk of memories he'd never shared with anyone. At 75 years old, John's frame was lean and sturdy, like a soldier who had survived the worst of wars. Each step he took landed with the firm echo of boots on the damp earth of Vietnam's Central Highlands. His faded military jacket and scuffed leather boots were his uniform every Sunday at Liberty Diner, precisely 9:30 a.m., never a minute late. He always chose the third booth by the window, where he could watch townsfolk passing by, and sunlight would catch a black and white photo of young John in uniform hanging above him. He spoke little, simply ordered a black coffee with 2 sugars and a BLT, cut diagonally, as always. He ate deliberately, slowly, as if each bite and each sip were part of a ritual to carry him through another week. The servers all loved him. They knew John's habits, who he welcomed with a nod, and whom he avoided, and they knew that any mention of the war would send his gaze drifting, lost in memories of blood and smoke. To regulars, John embodied resilience, a veteran survivor living quietly yet faithfully, like the church bell that rang every Sunday morning. They called him Liberty's last soldier. But then, everything began to change. The Franklin Hotel Group, a major investment chain aiming to upgrade the town's dining experience, bought Liberty Diner. Immediately, they replaced all the staff, removed the old jukebox, repainted the walls in icy neutrals, and swapped the red vinyl booths for gleaming steel chairs. The space now looked like a modern cafe, devoid of smoky bacon scents at dawn and filled instead with synthetic vanilla from an aroma diffuser. More importantly, they appointed a new manager, Ethan Hayes, a clean-cut, razor-sharp 30-something from the city, pragmatic and cold. To Ethan, every aspect of the diner was measurable in data and profit margins. The old Liberty Diner was an aesthetic embarrassment begging for a makeover, and John Miller, with his worn jacket, scuffed boots, and quiet demeanor, was nothing more than a blemish on the new brand Ethan was crafting. Ethan knew nothing of the diner's history. He didn't know that John had once volunteered as the town's protector, organizing annual war memorials. To Ethan, he was just a strange old man taking up space and ordering too little. Hardly the vibe Ethan wanted to attract. Young city folk with smartphones, lattes, and a hunger for Instagram check-ins. Then one Sunday, a morning that seemed ordinary but would become fateful, everything shifted. John arrived at 9:30 as always. The Liberty Diner door swung open with its familiar chime. But this time, no one greeted him. No smiles, no coffee delivered as usual. The diner felt sterile, as if encased in an invisible glass. Ethan's cold gaze swept over him from behind the counter. Not the look of a host, but of someone judging who belonged in his brand space. Ethan strode forward, quick, decisive, as though fearing John might ruin his perfect design, and uttered words no one at Liberty Diner had ever imagined in 60 years. That morning, for John, was a battle without gunfire, but it was still a fight, an assault on his dignity, his memories, his very identity as a soldier who had sacrificed his youth for his country. He did not know that, by stepping through those doors, he would face a new enemy, not armed troops, but the coldness of modernity, the contempt for the past, and the brutality of a world with no place for living symbols like him. Amidst harsh LED lights and stylized murals, the third booth by the window stood empty, just like him. But John stood tall. His eyes remained sharp as ever. And though some might forget, and Liberty Diner might change, the spirit of a soldier, the spirit, would never fade. No matter how they looked at him, he would still walk through those doors, a reminder that some things can never be replaced by a brand. 2. John Miller gently pushed open the weathered glass door of Liberty Diner, his home away from home for so many years, an indispensable part of his life. But today, something was different. Right above the entrance, a new brass plaque gleamed. Liberty Diner, under new management, where every meal rings with freedom. John froze for a heartbeat. He read the line over and over, and a fleeting smile touched his lips. But it was not the smile of joy. It was the bitter smile of a man who once lay in a battlefield, who watched comrades fall for those two words, freedom, and now saw them reduced to a cheap slogan. He stepped inside. The familiar jingle of the doorbell rang out, but no one looked up to greet him. No warm eyes from the old staff, no aroma of fresh pastries or laughter spilling from the kitchen. Instead, the scent of industrial floor cleaner and lifeless rows of shining chairs. Then he saw him, Ethan Hayes. Ethan, the diner's new manager, stood by the register, arms crossed, his face etched with annoyance as if John's very presence were a nuisance. The moment the old veteran entered, Ethan strode forward. No greeting, no polite smile, only a chilling declaration. "We're busy. You can't sit here." John glanced around. Half the tables were empty. Coffee still dripped quietly from the machine. Young people buried their faces in their phones. A few couples chatted softly. Busy? He saw nothing of the sort. "We need a certain type of customer," Ethan continued, his eyes flicking over John's faded jacket, his old uniform worn every Sunday, his look of undisguised contempt plain as day. John stood quietly, refusing to fight. He tried to keep his voice steady, though his hand gripped his cane so tightly it trembled. I come here every week," he began, but Ethan gave him no chance. "Get out, old man!" he shouted, his voice booming in the suddenly silent diner. "You're scaring the customers!" For a moment, the entire diner fell mute. No one spoke up. No one defended him. A few giggles rose from the group of teens by the window, kids who knew nothing of war and cared even less about the sacrifices made so they could live free. John felt his face burn. Blood roared in his ears, not with anger, but with shame. The hush around him was a verdict. No one to stop this, no sympathetic glance. And he, the man who once stood in the line of fire to protect his country's flag, now stood in the place he loved, treated as a burden to be driven away. He turned away without a word, each step heavy, his cane tapping a lonely rhythm on the freshly polished tiles. Then suddenly, a sharp, unexpected sound, metal chair legs scraping the floor. All eyes swung toward the corner, where a man had risen to his feet. He made no fuss, showed no anger, but his firm stance and unwavering gaze shifted the atmosphere in an instant. James Carter, 46 years old, tall and broad, flecks of silver at his temples, wearing a dark shirt and simple jeans, stepped forward slowly. He need not speak loudly. His calm, authoritative voice was enough. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. He didn't raise his voice, yet in the way he stood and looked at Ethan, you felt an unspoken authority, one forged not in boardrooms or books, but in facing injustice and choosing to stand tall. Ethan faltered. His usual cold composure cracked. His mouth opened as if to reply, but no words came. No one knew exactly who James Carter was, though some recognized a former police officer, the son of the local auto shop owner who had served the community for decades. A man of few words, but always there when needed. The diner's air grew thick. Laughter and clinks of dishes vanished. Only the beating hearts of onlookers remained, because everyone sensed something monumental unfolding. A justice Fairview once prided itself on, now called back to life amid shiny chairs and harsh LED lights. James need not shout. He simply stood there, between John and Ethan, drawing a line between right and wrong, between memory and greed, between those who built this town with blood and sweat, and those who came only to reshape it for profit. James Carter wasn't the sort of man who commanded attention when he entered a room. He didn't need expensive suits or flamboyant gestures to assert his presence. In a simple blue shirt and worn jeans, he looked no different than any other man finishing a shift at the machine shop. Yet if you looked into his eyes, you'd know at once. There was nothing ordinary about him. Those eyes, deep and sharp as a steel blade, belonged not merely to someone who had seen more than most, but to someone who had survived in places where only alertness and courage would keep you alive. James had been a special operations soldier in an elite unit, and though he'd long since left the military, those skills and that grit never left him. James hadn't come to Liberty Diner to start trouble. He'd simply dropped in, as he always did, for a cup of hot coffee on a quiet weekend morning. He never imagined he'd witness a scene that would set his blood boiling, a proud, weary older man being publicly humiliated, all because he didn't fit the brand image the diner's new manager was hell-bent on enforcing. John Miller, a veteran who once placed his life on the line in Vietnam, had just been driven from the place he'd called home for years. James saw it all: Ethan's scornful glare, the bitter shame etched on John's face, and he knew he couldn't stand by. As John bowed his head and turned away, his hand trembling on his cane, James pushed back his chair. The screech of metal legs on tile rang out like an alarm. No one in the diner spoke, but heads began to turn, not because James raised his voice, but because his calm yet resolute bearing sliced through the dense silence and injustice. "You're old enough to know what's right, aren't you?" James asked as he stepped toward Ethan. His tone was measured, but it cut through the air like an order. Ethan hesitated, yet still wore that arrogant half-smile. James looked back to John, his gaze softened with respect. He didn't need to ask about John's past. Seeing how John held himself, He understood. A man who'd paid dearly for the two words, freedom. "Sir, there's an empty booth," James said, gentle yet firm. "I'd be honored to join you." John hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because he'd grown accustomed to being ignored, to those Sunday mornings alone in a corner as memories faded. This unexpected kindness left him momentarily at a loss. "I don't want to cause trouble," John murmured, glancing back at Ethan as if seeking permission merely to exist. James nodded. "No trouble at all," he replied, offering a rare, genuine smile that radiated sincerity. "You're making my morning worthwhile." Without waiting further, James stepped around Ethan and moved toward the booth he'd occupied, placing a steady hand on John's shoulder in wordless encouragement. They sat down together. James signaled to the new staff, clearly unaccustomed to this scenario, and then spoke loudly, clearly, and authoritatively, as if giving a marching order. "2 coffees, 1 diagonally cut BLT, right away." The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. A few patrons gazed down at their cups, pretending to be engrossed. But the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone felt it. Ethan, unable to maintain his usual composure, stepped forward, his voice snapping with indignation. "I have the right to refuse service." James lifted his eyes to meet Ethan's. He said nothing at first. His calm gaze measured every beat of Ethan's heart. Then, in 5 slow, precise words, neither shouted nor hushed, yet resonating through every corner of the diner, he delivered a prophecy. "You'll regret this before sunset." A single sentence, nothing more, but it sent shock waves through the room. Ethan sneered. To him, it was just an empty threat from a self-righteous customer. Yet the way James spoke, unyielding, unhesitating, as if he knew the outcome, made everyone present sense. Something was coming. James returned to stirring his coffee. No more words were needed. But at every table, glances shifted. The new servers' hands trembled. The rowdy teens went silent. And in their minds echoed a single haunting question. What did James Carter know that Ethan didn't? Over the next 40 minutes, no one in Liberty Diner suspected they were witnessing a new chapter quietly being written in Fairview, between 2 men, seated face to face in a simple booth by the window. James Carter and John Miller, one a former special operations soldier, the other a Marine veteran, spoke as if they were old friends reunited after years apart. Yet in truth, they had never met before. No explanation was needed. No recounting of losses, sacrifices, or long nights in distant battlefields. They understood each other not through words, but through a respectful silence. They spoke of the river that ran along the town's edge, once the perfect summer fishing spot. They mentioned last year's downpour that washed away the old bridge, and how Fairview High's football team had just lost the playoff game after a dropped catch in the final minute. All those seemingly ordinary details became the bond between 2 generations of soldiers, people who had learned to find life amid dead ground. Not once did war come up, yet in every glance, every breath, one truth remained unspoken. Each had lost something no civilian could comprehend, and in that shared moment on an otherwise ordinary morning, they rediscovered a part of themselves, buried beneath dust and society's forgetfulness. When James laid a bill on the table and lifted his cup for the last sip, he glanced at his watch, then out the window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, bathing the polished wood in a gentle glow. The sky was impossibly clear, stretching wide above them. "A beautiful day," he murmured. John nodded in agreement, unaware that something was approaching outside. A transformation was coming, not only for him, but for Fairview itself, and for Liberty Diner. The event had actually been set in motion earlier by a single message. When James rose to defend John, in those few brief seconds, he sent a simple text to a contact he had never deleted. "Liberty Diner, need you." Just 5 words, but enough to stir the past. That message wasn't sent to just anyone. It went to a man who owed John Miller an unrepayable debt, from a merciless rainy night in Vietnam's Central Highlands. That night, a Marine unit was ambushed with no clear path of retreat. In the chaos, John, then a sergeant, turned back alone, leading 15 men out of the kill zone despite orders to withdraw and danger at every turn. All 15 survived, including one who would rise to become one of the most powerful figures in the U.S. military. At that moment, the Liberty Diner doorbell rang. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. The man who entered needed no introduction. His 4-star Marine uniform gleamed with medals across the chest. His presence drew every eye. He was General Robert Lawson. He walked slowly but with purpose, gait of a man who had led thousands through war. The room seemed to shrink. Whispers faded. Curious stares turned to reverence. A server froze mid-step, hands trembling. General Lawson did not glance about. He strode directly to the booth where John and James sat. Then, in absolute silence, he paused, stood at attention, and brought his hand to his forehead in a perfect salute. "Sergeant John Miller," he said in a deep, warm voice that seemed to echo from the past. "It's been too long." John, stunned, could scarcely believe his eyes. He reflexively rose, but Lawson gently raised his hand. "Please, sit." That command resonated not just for John, but for the entire room. He deserves honor. He deserves a seat. He deserves to be heard. From the back office, Ethan emerged. His face went pale. Arrogance vanished. Seeing the guest of honor, he was almost speechless. What is happening here?" he stammered, eyes darting in search of an excuse. General Lawson turned to face Ethan. His gaze shone like a spotlight on someone hiding in darkness. Then, in a resonant tone that filled the space, "I've come to honor the man who saved my life and the lives of 14 others back in 1969. The diner exploded in emotion. No one could hold back. Some wept. Others placed hands over their hearts. A few rose slowly as if on instinct. Regulars and newcomers alike looked at John with newfound gratitude and respect. And Ethan, he stood frozen, rooted to the spot. Every word from Lawson reverberated in his mind. There was nowhere left to hide, no brand image left to protect. In the hushed pause of Liberty Diner, General Robert Lawson began to recount a story none in the room could have foreseen. Every word he spoke seemed to awaken memories dormant for decades. The clink of knives on plates, the stirring of coffee spoons, all vanished in this unprecedented solemnity. He didn't need notes. Each detail emerged vividly, as if it happened just yesterday. It was April 12, 1969, outside Cam Lo, Vietnam. His helicopter, then serving as the battalion commander, was shot down into a gauntlet of enemy fire. Through black smoke and deafening gunfire, a Marine unit was pinned in the jungle, cut off from base, without reinforcements, and nearly out of hope. "We were driven into a death valley," Lawson said, his eyes hardening as though he still heard his comrades' screams. Among the few who remained calm in the chaos, one Marine disregarded a leg wound, thought nothing of himself, and dashed into the hail of bullets to pull his comrades from the trap. That Marine was Sergeant John Miller, wounded yet carrying a fellow Marine, almost his own weight, for 3 miles through dense jungle, not only keeping him alive but organizing a hasty defense, commanding the rest to hold until rescue arrived. He wasn't just a soldier. Lawson paused, his voice dropping yet echoing with strength through the years. He is the reason we're alive today. The diner's patrons were hypnotized. Some covered their mouths, unable to contain emotion. Young people, who believed war existed only on screens, were stunned as a living fragment of history sat before them in the humble form of an elderly man in a faded jacket. Ethan, the new manager, could no longer maintain his usual confidence. His face drained pale, lips pressed tight in a futile effort at composure. He stammered an apology, hoping to salvage the moment. I didn't know who he was." General Lawson turned, his voice low yet every word striking like a hammer. "You didn't ask." A beat of silence. Then Lawson continued, voice heavy with restraint. "You saw an old man walk in and assumed he was worthless. That wasn't just a mistake. It was disrespect. To him, and to those who sacrificed so we could have a peaceful breakfast today." The atmosphere erupted. A silver-haired veteran, wearing a veteran's jacket, rose to his feet. He stepped forward, tears in his eyes, hand over heart. No words were needed. His gesture spoke for a generation. A young waitress, eyes glistening, whispered as Lawson returned to his seat. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. Thank you, sir. Thank you for everything." Outside the glass pane, another quiet scene was unfolding. No one noticed when it began, but dozens of sleek black government SUVs had lined up along the town's main street. Men in black stood beside them, earpieces in place, eyes sharp, an image plucked straight from a political thriller. A crowd started to gather. A few curious Fairview residents drifted over. Then more, until within minutes, the block in front of Liberty Diner had become a focal point. Local TV cameras appeared. Microphones bearing national news logos peeked out from behind the growing throng. Inside, patrons, many of whom had witnessed Ethan's conduct, began to rise. Some approached John, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Others bowed their heads in silent apology. Nods of respect, murmurs of thanks, and looks of admiration filled the space. No one remembered BLTs or morning coffee anymore. Only one truth remained: the presence of a silent hero, and the reality just laid bare. Overwhelmed by the wave of emotion, John bowed his head, voice trembling. "I just did what I thought was right." General Lawson smiled, the smile of a man who'd seen both war and peace, the best and worst of humanity, and said, "No, John, you did what only you could do." In the corner, no one noticed James Carter rise. He didn't wait for applause, nor did he need a handshake from the officials. He simply slipped toward the back exit, his dark blue shirt melding with the sunlight dancing on the old brick wall. He knew he didn't need to stay. The mission was accomplished, the truth had been revealed, and the man who needed to stand tall had been granted his rightful place. He wasn't the hero in the eyes of the press. But his actions, a timely stand, a brief message, a deed untouched by fame or gain, sparked a transformation in Fairview's heart. From a small diner, a ripple spread, of respect, of the power of memory, and of never judging a person by appearances alone. Just 1 week after that fateful morning at Liberty Diner, the aftershocks of the event had spread far beyond tiny Fairview. Videos capturing General Lawson's solemn entrance, his moving salute to the elderly veteran, went viral on social media, millions of shares, tens of thousands of comments. National outlets began to ask, how many heroes walk among us, unknown, uncelebrated? The public outcry wasn't sparked by scandal, it was ignited by a forgotten truth awakened. and this time, society did not look away. Franklin Corporation, the new owner of the Liberty Diner chain, could not ignore that wave of outrage and emotion. Less than 7 days later, they held a press conference, issued a public apology to Fairview and to all U.S. veterans. That apology came with concrete actions. They fired Ethan Hayes, the manager who had insulted John Miller, but they went further. His replacement was a man who understood sacrifice, a former U.S. Army Staff Sergeant, a veteran of Afghanistan, someone who knew that sometimes a seat or a glance could carry an entire story. At Booth 3, where John Miller had sat for decades, a gleaming brass plaque was now installed with care. Its hand-engraved inscription, chosen after community meetings with the new management, read, "Dedicated to those who bear the burden of freedom." Beneath it hung a black and white photo of John at 23, in his marine dress blues, eyes steely and proud, physique strong, lips curved in a smile that hinted at tireless resolve. It was more than a portrait of John Miller. It was the emblem of a generation. From that day on, that booth was reserved for John every Sunday morning, an unspoken ritual, not merely because he was a regular, but because everyone who walked into Liberty Diner knew they were sitting where history had been made. When Veterans Day arrived, Liberty Diner did the unprecedented. They offered free meals all day to veterans and their families. No ID cards, no reservations required. Just bring your story and your pride. That gesture sparked a ripple effect. Cafes, diners, small businesses in neighboring towns followed suit, not for profit, but for inspiration. An empty chair was always placed beside John, not because of a missing guest, but for the stranger who stood up. A man without fame, without recognition, but whose act changed everything. That stranger, James Carter, never returned to Liberty Diner after that morning. He was nowhere to be seen amid media throngs, never sought credit. He slipped out the back door as quietly as he came in, leaving nothing behind but a single deed. Yet James's legacy did not vanish. In Fairview's story, his name was passed down as a silent torch. He became the nameless symbol proving one truth: that a person who dares to stand up at the right moment can transform a whole community. What few knew was that James was not anonymous. Some old comrades, guardians of memory, whispered the rest of the tale. James Carter was the son of the Marine John Miller carried through the jungle in 1969. That man had been gravely wounded, almost out of hope. Yet John, his own leg bleeding, crossed 3 miles of hostile jungle, under fire and choking smoke, to save one comrade's life. That comrade survived, married, had children, and raised James with kindness as his guiding principle. Every Christmas, General Lawson still sent the Carter family a handwritten card, simple, unsentimental, just one line in black ink, steady script. We owe him everything. And so we do. The Liberty Diner story isn't just about John Miller. It isn't merely about war, injustice, or a misguided manager. It's about the power of silent courage, about ordinary people who, in the right moment, can achieve the extraordinary. In an age when the world is too busy to listen, too hurried to honor, this story is a wake-up call. Share your thoughts on this tale. What do you make of John's actions and Liberty Diner's transformation? Don't forget to comment below with the state you're watching from in the U.S. If this story touched your heart, send it to family and friends, because they, too, might need a reminder that true valor never goes out of style.